On January 4th, 46 BC, on the open plains of Ruspina in North Africa, Julius Caesar led 30 cohorts out of his camp on what was intended to be a routine supply run for grain, only to walk directly into a meticulously engineered trap set by his former top lieutenant, Titus Labienus. Facing acute food shortages along the coast of modern-day Tunisia, Caesar brought roughly 14,000 heavy infantry and a mere 400 cavalry onto the plain to gather barley from nearby estates. 3 miles from camp, his forward scouts reported an approaching force. Labienus had packed light skirmishers tightly between his horsemen, creating a visual illusion that tricked Caesar's scouts into expecting a standard infantry engagement. When the distant veil of dust lifted, the illusion dissolved to reveal thousands of light Numidian horsemen and veteran Gallic cavalry fanning out across the horizon. Within hours, Caesar's force found itself completely surrounded in an open, flat expanse with no secure flanks to anchor. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the Battle of Ruspina, an operational crisis that nearly destroyed Caesar before his campaign in Africa could even begin. We will examine how an asymmetric cavalry doctrine exploited Roman heavy infantry tactics, how field engineering and split-second command decisions averted total annihilation, and why this overlooked clash reshaped Caesar's approach to war. How did Caesar's former second-in-command, who knew every tactical habit of the Roman dictator, craft a trap that turned Roman discipline into a deadly liability? After the defeat of the Pompeian armies at Pharsalus in 48 BC and the assassination of Pompey in Egypt, the surviving leaders of the Roman Republican faction refused to submit. Reassembling their shattered forces, the Optimates fled to Africa Proconsularis, modern-day Tunisia. This province was not merely a convenient refuge. It was the agricultural engine of the Western Mediterranean and the primary granary feeding the city of Rome. Under the moral leadership of Marcus Porcius Cato, the younger and the formal military command of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Scipio, the Optimates transformed North Africa into an unassailable bastion. Their strategic goal was clear. By controlling the grain supply, they could threaten Italy with starvation, erode Caesar's political standing in the capital, and buy time to construct an overwhelming military force. To counter Caesar's disciplined legionaries, the Optimates formed a crucial alliance with King Juba I of Numidia. The Numidian monarch brought vast strategic mobility to the coalition, contributing thousands of native light horsemen alongside a corps of 120 war elephants. By late 47 BC, Metellus Scipio commanded 10 legions supported by these extensive African auxiliaries. Caesar, meanwhile, was constrained by compounding political crises. Having barely survived the Alexandrian War and secured Asia Minor, he returned to Rome only to face economic turmoil and dangerous mutinies among his veteran legions in Campania. He recognized that granting the Optimates time to consolidate would allow them to establish an effective naval blockade against Italy. Strategic considerations forced Caesar to act before his army was fully prepared. Ignoring standard Roman military doctrine, which suspended naval operations during the winter months, he marched south to Lilybaeum, on the western tip of Sicily, in December 47 BC. Demonstrating his characteristic urgency, Caesar pitched his tent directly on the beach so that the crashing surf served as an unceasing reminder to his troops to remain in a state of constant readiness. Yet his haste created severe operational vulnerabilities. Short on transport vessels, he could not cross with his entire army at once. On December 25, 47 BC, Caesar ordered his initial convoy to set sail into the unpredictable winter sea. Mid-crossing, a severe winter gale struck the fleet, dispersing the transport vessels across the open Mediterranean. When Caesar stepped ashore near Hadramedum on December 28th, he discovered that the elements had shattered his operational plan. Instead of leading an invading host, the dictator found himself isolated on hostile soil with a tiny vanguard of roughly 3,500 infantry and 150 cavalry. He possessed no supply train, no baggage, and no immediate news of his missing ships, while the combined armies of Metellus Scipio and King Juba mobilized in the interior. Upon making landfall near Hadramedum on December 28, 47 BC, Caesar attempted to negotiate with the city's Optimate commander, Gaius Considius Longus. When his envoy was rejected and the gates remained barred, Caesar realized his vulnerable vanguard of 3,500 infantry and 150 cavalry could not risk an immediate siege. He ordered a controlled, fighting withdrawal along the coast to the small maritime town of Ruspina, arriving on December 29th. Ruspina offered two critical assets: an open harbor to receive incoming supply transports and a defensible coastal foothold. Yet, as scattered ships trickled in over the following days, bringing 4 additional legions of recruits, and the veteran 5th Legion Alaudae, the fundamental crisis of the campaign deepened. The army Caesar now assembled at Ruspina was severely compromised by the nature of its hasty departure from Sicily. To maximize human payload on his limited shipping, Caesar had prohibited his soldiers from embarking with baggage, pack animals, tents, or camp followers. Moreover, except for the 5th Legion, his 5 other legions consisted almost entirely of raw recruits, Tyrones, who had never experienced the chaotic realities of pitched battle or severe operational hardship. Without pack mules to carry supplies inland or sufficient cavalry to screen foraging parties, Caesar was logistically paralyzed, anchored strictly to a narrow coastal strip, barely 6 miles deep. This paralysis played directly into the Optimate defensive strategy. Metellus Scipio and Labienus had systematically stripped the surrounding countryside, compelling local towns to move their grain and barley reserves into heavily fortified strongholds, while destroying remaining crops in the fields. Deprived of local resources, the Cesarian army faced immediate starvation as winter weather hindered the arrival of grain convoys from Sicily and Sardinia. Lacking proper canvas tents, legionaries huddled beneath crude shelters woven from dry twigs and reeds, exposed to bitter winter rain and hail. The cost of basic food skyrocketed within the camp, exhausting the soldiers' private savings and severely threatening troop morale. By the morning of January 4th, 46 BC, the supply crisis had reached a critical threshold. With no grain left in his storehouses and the horses of his cavalry starving, Caesar took a calculated risk. He ordered 30 cohorts, representing roughly 14,000 to 15,000 infantrymen, along with 400 horsemen and 150 archers, to march out of the Ruspina fortifications into the open monastir plain to sweep the countryside for unharvested barley. It was a massive, heavily armed foraging expedition born out of sheer desperation. But as Caesar moved 3 miles inland from the safety of his camp, he was entirely unaware that scout reports of his departure had already reached Titus Labienus, who was lurking nearby with a tailored strike force designed specifically for his destruction. Titus Labienus was uniquely equipped to confront the Roman dictator. Having served as Caesar's primary field legate throughout the Gallic Wars, Labienus had commanded legions in his commander's absence and shared credit for some of Caesar's greatest military triumphs. When civil war erupted in 49 BC, Labienus made the calculated decision to defect to the Pompeian cause, driven by personal ambition, constitutional conviction, or resentment over remaining in Caesar's shadow. Unlike other Optimate leaders who viewed Caesar through a lens of aristocratic contempt, Labienus intimately understood Caesar's operational habits, his preference for rapid, aggressive thrusts, his willingness to march without adequate logistical buffers, and his over-reliance on the tactical superiority of Roman heavy infantry. While Metellus Scipio remained 3 days away with the main Optimate army, Labienus held independent field command of a fast-moving strike force, supported by 2 subordinates, the Petraeus brothers. His force was explicitly built to wage an asymmetric war against heavy infantry. Labienus fielded between 8,000 and 9,600 Numidian light horsemen, supported by 1,600 battle-hardened Gallic and Germanic heavy cavalry veterans who had followed him since the Gallic campaigns. To complement this mounted arm, he brought thousands of light-armed Numidian skirmishers, equipped with javelins, slings, and bows. Modern historical estimates vary regarding the exact number of light foot soldiers, ranging from 22,000 to over 50,000 men. Significantly, although the Optimate coalition maintained dozens of war elephants in Africa, Labienus deployed no elephants during this initial encounter at Ruspina. Recognizing that Caesar's force comprised only 400 cavalry, Labienus devised a clever tactical deception to lure the dictator into a vulnerable position on the open plain. He arranged his horsemen in dense, tightly packed ranks and interspersed them with light-armed javelin throwers. From 3 miles away, as dust billowed across the dry horizon, Caesar's advanced scouts observed what appeared to be a solid, deep formation of standard heavy infantry advancing in close order. Trusting the report of his scouts, Caesar deployed his 30 cohorts into a single extended line, intending to engage and overpower a conventional foot army. This extended linear deployment was precisely the mistake Labienus had calculated Caesar would make. By stretching his infantry horizontally across the plain to match the perceived width of the enemy line, Caesar thinned his formation and left both flanks exposed. As the distance between the 2 forces closed, Labienus ordered his riders to drop the illusion. The dense cavalry ranks split apart, fanning out across the flat terrain to envelop both swords of Caesar's army. Before the Cesarian centurions could adjust their ranks, the trap closed, transforming a routine grain sweep into a desperate struggle for survival. As the veil of dust cleared, the full scope of Labienus's maneuver became terrifyingly visible to the Cesarian ranks. The Numidian light cavalry swept around both swords of Caesar's extended line, riding without bridles and unleashing continuous showers of javelins. When a Cesarian cohort attempted to charge forward to engage the attackers, the mobile Numidians effortlessly galloped out of range, turning in their saddles to hurl missiles as they retreated. As soon as the heavy Roman infantry halted, winded and out of breath, the light horsemen swarmed back around their exposed flanks and rears. Within minutes, the linear formation crumbled into a series of isolated defensive clusters, and Caesar's 30 cohorts found themselves entirely surrounded in a shrinking ring of iron and wood. This asymmetric doctrine exposed the fundamental limitation of standard Roman heavy infantry tactics when stripped of cavalry support. Heavy Roman armor, including the Lorica Hamata mail cuirass and the wooden scutum shield, had been developed for structured, front-to-front engagements against stationary infantry lines. Against an elusive enemy that refused close-quarters combat, the weight of this gear became an exhausting burden. Unaccustomed to such fluid, non-traditional tactics, Caesar's raw recruits, Tyrones, succumbed to psychological shock. Instinctively recoiling from the rain of missiles, the soldiers pressed inward toward the center of their cohorts, seeking safety behind their comrades' shields. This reflexive inward contracting triggered a dangerous mechanical crisis known to ancient commanders as crowd crush. As the outer ranks were forced back by the relentless missile bombardment, the physical density within the Cesarian formation rose toward a critical threshold. Squeezed shoulder to shoulder, legionaries lost the physical space necessary to draw their gladius short swords, draw back their arms to hurl pila, or even raise their heavy shields above their heads. Men in the interior ranks were blinded by dust, unable to see the enemy or gauge the battlefield situation, hearing only the impacted thuds of javelins against shield bosses and the mounting screams of the wounded. Immobilized by their own sheer numbers, the cohorts risked being systematically picked apart without ever striking a single blow in return. Sensing total victory, Titus Labienus rode bareheaded along the perimeter of the trapped Cesarian cohorts, ensuring every legionary could recognize his face. He shouted taunts across the shrinking gaps, mocking the trapped troops as inexperienced recruits who had been abandoned by their reckless dictator. The psychological effect of seeing their general's former master of cavalry directing their destruction pushed the morale of the inexperienced recruits to the verge of total collapse. Order dissolved into chaos, and panic swept along the thinned Roman ranks as centurions fell under missile fire. Seeing the surrounding ring close tightly, an Aquilifer, the senior standard-bearer carrying the sacred eagle of his legion, turned his back on the enemy and began to flee toward the interior. Seeing the ultimate symbol of Roman military honor about to lead a general rout, Caesar himself sprinted into the fray, grabbed the terrified soldier by the neck of his armor, and physically spun him around toward the enemy. According to Roman biographical tradition, Caesar bellowed, "The enemy is over there," as he spun the stunned standard-bearer back toward the fighting line. Restoring order at the center, Caesar immediately issued a strict command across his ranks. No legionary was permitted to advance or pursue the enemy more than 5 paces beyond the formation. This rigid spatial boundary prevented eager soldiers from being drawn out into isolation, forcing the cohorts to maintain a tightly unified front that negated the hit-and-run tactics of the Numidian skirmishers. With the perimeter momentarily stabilized, Caesar executed a complex and dangerous maneuver to break the encirclement. He ordered his infantry to stretch their line horizontally to widen their frontage and thin the surrounding ring of enemy cavalry. Then, centurions passed the command for every second cohort to rotate 180 degrees. By turning alternate units back to back, Caesar transformed his trapped stationary square into a dynamic two-faced combat line, facing simultaneously outward and inward. On his signal, the forward cohorts charged straight ahead, while the inverted cohorts launched a synchronized countercharge in the opposite direction. This sudden two-directional offensive shattered the expectations of the Optimate commanders. Accustomed to harassing a passive target, the Numidian horsemen were thrown into disarray as heavy Roman infantry surged toward them from both sides, throwing their heavy javelins at point-blank range. The synchronized shock charge physically severed the encircling ring in 2 places, forcing the light cavalry to scatter and opening a broad operational corridor across the plain. During the height of this breakout, an encounter took place that briefly halted the Optimate momentum. As Titus Labienus rode along the front, trying to rally his horsemen, a veteran of the 10th Legion, a unit recently in disgrace for mutiny, stepped out from the Roman line. Unbuckling his helmet, the veteran pulled off his headgear so his former legate would recognize him. Shouting across the field that Labienus would now learn how a soldier of the 10th fought, the legionary hurled his heavy javelin with full force into the chest of Labienus's horse. The mount collapsed, throwing the Optimate field commander heavily to the ground. Though Labienus was rescued by his guards, his sudden disappearance from the line sparked brief panic among his ranks, stalling the Optimate command structure. Seizing the moment, Caesar began a disciplined, step-by-step withdrawal toward his coastal base at Ruspina. Moving in their double-fronted formation, the cohorts shielded their wounded in the center while methodically repelling repeated skirmish attacks. Yet, just as the Cesarian ranks broke clear of the initial trap and began their orderly march back, a fresh plume of dust billowed over the southern hills. Marcus Petraeus and Gnaeus Piso had arrived on the field with 1,600 elite heavy horsemen and thousands of light infantry, sweeping down directly onto Caesar's exhausted rearguard. Marcus Petraeus and Gnaeus Piso slammed into the Cesarian rearguard with 1,600 fresh, heavy cavalry accompanied by a formidable contingent of light infantry. Having fought continuously since mid-morning under the harsh North African sun, Caesar's legionaries were severely dehydrated and nearing physical exhaustion. The sudden appearance of these Optimate reinforcements threatened to collapse the rear of the column, re-encircling the army just as it approached the safety of the coastal hills. Recognizing that an orderly retreat was impossible while the enemy held the tactical initiative on the flat terrain, Caesar ordered a final, aggressive counteroffensive. He turned his tired cohorts around once more and spearheaded a direct assault up the adjacent ridges to dislodge the enemy skirmishers who had seized the high ground. In the fierce fighting that followed, Marcus Petraeus sustained a severe wound and was carried from the field. The loss of their battlefield commander halted the Optimate momentum, allowing the Cesarian units to secure the crest of the hills and establish a defensive ridgeline overlooking the plain. With the high ground secured, Caesar held the ridge until late afternoon to prevent the Optimate cavalry from bypassing his flanks. As dusk fell, he initiated a methodical, step-by-step withdrawal, using the terrain to shield his columns from further missile fire. The Cesarian cohorts pulled back into the fortified camp at Ruspina without falling into a general panic, preserving the core structure and cohesion of their army. The true casualty figures of the battle remain a subject of significant historical disagreement. The anonymous author of De Bello Africo, writing from a pro-Cesarian perspective, minimized the dictator's losses to a negligible fraction. Conversely, later classical historians such as Appian and Cassius Dio, supported by modern historical analysis, estimate that Caesar suffered heavy casualties, losing up to 1/3 of his total force, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 men killed or wounded. Optimate losses were considerably lighter, generally estimated between 500 and 2,000 men. In strict tactical terms, Ruspina was a clear Optimate victory. Caesar failed in his primary mission to secure grain, lost control of the open field, and was forced into a hazardous retreat. Yet, in operational terms, Caesar achieved a vital survival by keeping the core frame of his army intact under circumstances that would have destroyed a less disciplined commander. Yet, as night settled over the coastal camp at Ruspina, the relief of surviving the battle quickly dissolved into the grim reality of their situation. Trapped inside a narrow perimeter with their backs to the sea, Caesar's surviving troops possessed no grain, no fresh supplies, and no dry fodder for their starving horses, while Labienus and the Optimate army established a tight land blockade just beyond their ramparts. Caesar recognized that his survival depended on securing his sea line of communication while surviving the Optimate blockade. He ordered his legionaries to construct an elaborate system of field fortifications around the Ruspina camp. To guarantee access to freshwater springs along the shore and protect incoming naval transports from enemy cavalry raids, Caesar had his engineers excavate 2 parallel defensive trenches extending from the main camp earthworks all the way into the breaking surf. This fortified corridor formed a secure beachhead, allowing supply ships from Sicily to unload without interference, even as Optimate patrols roamed the surrounding plain. Despite this coastal link, severe winter weather kept supply convoys sporadic, and fodder for the cavalry mounts remained almost non-existent. Facing the imminent loss of his remaining war horses, Caesar devised an unusual logistical expedient. He ordered his men to gather marine seaweed washed up along the beach, rinse the salt away in wooden tubs of fresh water, and mix the cleaned kelp with small allotments of dry grass to keep the animals alive. Simultaneously, to address his critical shortage of light infantry, Caesar stripped his transport ships of their crews, drafting rowers and sailors directly into the army. He distributed newly forged weapons, organizing these naval personnel into specialized light units of slingers and javelin throwers. Inside the Ruspina camp, Caesar transformed his headquarters into an improvised industrial center. Field smithies operated day and night, converting scrap iron and timber into javelins, sling bullets, and arrowheads. Legionaries were assigned to dig subterranean storage vaults to locate local caches of hidden grain mentioned by regional informers. Even as Metellus Scipio finally joined Labienus with his main force, bringing the total Optimate army to tens of thousands of troops, the formidable height of the Ruspina ramparts, paired with Caesar's extensive battery of defensive artillery, scorpions and catapults, deterred the Republican commanders from attempting a direct assault on the camp. To break the strategic stalemate without risking another pitched battle on unfavorable terrain, Caesar activated an asymmetric alliance on the Optimate western flank. He coordinated with Publius Sitius, an exiled Roman adventurer and mercenary captain operating in Mauritania. Partnering with King Bacchus II, Sitius launched a swift, surprise invasion into western Numidia and captured King Juba's wealthy royal capital at Cirta. The sudden loss of his capital forced King Juba to immediately withdraw substantial forces, including thousands of Numidian cavalry and a major detachment of war elephants, away from the main Optimate army to defend his own realm, significantly weakening Metellus Scipio's operational strength at a crucial moment. Caesar's combination of field engineering, improvised logistics, and strategic manipulation allowed his army to hold out through the worst months of the African winter. By late March 46 BC, the maritime weather cleared, and transport fleets carrying the battle-tested veterans of the 9th and 10th legions, alongside substantial stores of grain, safely dropped anchor off Ruspina. With his veteran corps restored and his logistical crisis resolved, Caesar was finally prepared to step out from behind his earthworks and force the Optimates into a decisive test of arms. The near disaster at Ruspina fundamentally altered how Caesar prepared his army for the remainder of the African campaign. Realizing his raw recruits were entirely unaccustomed to non-traditional warfare, he subjected them to an intensive, specialized training regimen. Ancient sources note that Caesar coached his troops much like a gladiatorial instructor, teaching recruits the exact distance to step back, how to wheel around efficiently, and how to throw light javelins at elusive skirmishers. Furthermore, to neutralize the severe psychological effect of King Juba's war elephants, Caesar imported live beasts from Italy. He forced his legionaries and horses to touch the animals, grow familiar with their heavy scent and loud trumpeting, and practice striking their unarmored flanks with blunt javelins. These tactical adaptations bore decisive fruit on April 6, 46 BC, at the Battle of Thapsus. By trapping Metellus Scipio and King Juba on a narrow neck of land between a coastal lagoon and the Mediterranean, Caesar deprived the Optimate cavalry of the open space needed to execute the wide encirclements that had nearly undone him at Ruspina. When Caesar's light troops panicked, the Optimate war elephants with sling bullets and archer fire, the beasts trampled back through their own ranks, shattering the Optimate line. Caesar's veteran legions charged forward, turning the engagement into a complete rout that destroyed the Republican army in Africa. Metellus Scipio died attempting to flee by sea. King Juba committed suicide in a death pact with Marcus Petraeus, and Cato the Younger famously took his own life at Utica to avoid submission. Titus Labienus escaped to Hispania, only to fall a year later at the Battle of Munda in 45 BC. The clash at Ruspina remains one of the most balance-shifting operational episodes of Caesar's career. It highlighted his profound vulnerability when forced to field unseasoned recruits without sufficient cavalry, intelligence, or logistical buffers. Had Titus Labienus possessed heavy infantry reserves to pin Caesar's inverted cohorts on January 4th, 46 BC, the civil war might have ended with the dictator's destruction on the Monastir plain. Instead, Ruspina stands as a study in tactical resilience, demonstrating how a commander can survive an asymmetric trap, adapt under extreme operational pressure, and convert the lessons of a near defeat into total victory. If you found this tactical breakdown insightful, subscribe to World Chronicles to join us for our next journey into the crucial chapters of ancient history.